Welcome to session 3. In this session, we're going to revisit the ideas related to the legal environment in Ontario, Canada, and somewhat internationally as well. I'm going to refer you to your employment law course that you've taken and other courses that have talked about the legal environment. I won't get into the nitty gritty. We're going to talk about the law as it pertains to recruitment, selection, and talent management in general. Now, recruitment, selection, and the staffing process in general are sensitive to the legal environment. Think about it. When you hear the word discrimination in terms of employment, you're looking at why didn't a person get hired? Why didn't they get promoted? That would be staffing. There are several laws that are either provincial jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction, or pan-Canadian jurisdiction, and also international. And if you remember what pan-Canadian means, it's a law that applies to everybody or every sector within Canada, and federal only applies to federally regulated organizations and the federal government. So again, refer to your law course and your notes. This is an area I think you should be somewhat proficient in, at least fluent. Talking points, you don't have to be an expert in law. I think that's what lawyers do, but you should know enough about the law to know if you're going in a direction that might be sensitive. So let's have a look. The various laws that need to be considered when it comes to talent management or recruitment and selection, and you could almost make this list yourself based on your law course, are the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we don't directly quote the Charter of Rights and Freedoms all the time. It's just the highest law in the land, I suppose, that dictates that any other law below it cannot contradict what's in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We also are going to talk extensively about the Human Rights Code or the Human Rights Act, so provincially or federally, the Employment Standards Act, which is Ontario, we'll speak to specifically. However, almost every province and territory has similar acts that govern employment standards. And also the CLC, the Canada Labour Code. So if you're federal, it's the Canada Labour Code. If it's provincial, it's the Employment Standards laws. We'll talk about Employment Equity Act, Pay Equity Act, AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I always have trouble saying that, but let's call it AODA. The Ontario Labour Relations Act, Occupational Health and Safety Act, and the various privacy laws as outlined in an earlier course. So when we get into international law, it's nothing really specific to the employment setting, but the international human rights declarations and certain trade agreements kind of dictate how maybe workers or employees should be treated, and also how human rights are protected. So just think of it as an overlying type of set of guidelines and principles that dictate everything else that we do, right down to the provincial level. And just to remind you, there are no laws at the municipal level or regional level. There might be some bylaws and policy matter, but there are no specific laws. Now, unique to talent management, there are legal requirements that are specific and in some cases general to the recruitment side of things, the selection side of things, when you hire somebody, how you onboard orient, how you assess performance, mobility within the organization, training, and also the backside, which is the termination of employment. So we're going to look at the entire 360-degree kind of view of the employment relationship. But because this is the recruitment and selection course, we're going to focus mainly on the recruitment, the selection, and the hiring side. So let's get right into it. Human rights laws, if you think about it, right? Human rights laws are the most influential. Human rights laws are the most influential in the entire RNS process. And they should be, because words like stereotyping and discrimination and prejudice and bias come up. And these are things that the human rights laws cover. You don't see the Employment Standards Act covering that directly, although it might say that entitlement to parental leave might influence mostly, let's say, female employees, and things like so let's talk about the way people are recruited. If there are any exclusionary practices within your recruitment process, that might be detrimental to the rights of a person, an applicant in this case, or a candidate. The interview format that you might use, the nature of the questions, how you made the hiring decision, and how you manage the employee after the fact might also be covered by some law or some sort of a legal principle. So I want you to, again, just to remind you, refer to things you've learned in other courses, especially the employment law class, and ask yourself, how do these things I've learned in terms of the legal environment affect how I do recruitment and selection? And always keep in mind, we have lawyers, we have courts, we have laws in place because not every organization does things the way they're supposed to. Think about it, right? This part of the lesson is supposed to enlighten you and inform you as to how to protect the rights of those that you will be dealing with. Now, if we go back to the model that we looked at in session 1, the typical recruitment selection model, we always start with the demand. I mean, you have to have a demand before you hire somebody. Even if you hire somebody just off the cuff, willy-nilly, for no reason at all, the demand might be, I just wanted somebody, right? But usually there's a demand and there's a budget for it. We initiate the recruitment process where we start looking for people out there, out in the world, the labor market. And if you're creative enough in doing that, you're going to get a really good pool of applicants from which you can start the selection process. You can select from that pool. And the selection process in itself, a series of interviews, tests, background checks, whatever it might be, lead you to a smaller and smaller group of candidates, the best of the best, I suppose, or the best that have applied. And then from that, you pass through a series of filters to make a hiring decision. You decide on pay, benefit packages, terms of employment. And then we would orient or onboard them. And once that happens, hopefully you're looking at some sort of a performance measure or measures to see if the employee worked out or not. And then if not, you would let them go and you go back to the selection process. Let's have a look at each. The demand side, the legal influences could be stemming from the HR planning process to begin with. Generally demand is initiated because we have a plan for people. I need 10 people next summer. I'm in the golf industry. I need 150 people to run golf only in the summer. In December, during the holiday season, I might need to increase the number of retail salespeople. That's all part of planning. You foresee things in the future, the supply of people and the demand for people. Now that demand itself, through the planning process, should be free from bias. So if you have a whole lot of people you're going to promote into higher up positions, and then that creates a void down at the bottom, some demand at the bottom, so you need to recruit new people, you need to make sure that those promotion practices are free from bias, free from discrimination. I will only promote certain types of people. And it's not a bona fide requirement. You can easily say, I will only promote certain types of people, the type of people that have the highest competencies, the best performance measures, the fewest mistakes, and that's legitimate. But if you say, I'm only going to promote men, I'm only going to promote women, or a certain ethnic group, or you say, I won't promote the older people because they're not going to last too long. Well, those are discriminatory practices, and they have to be free from bias, the decisions you make. And of course, terminations. Who are you firing? On what basis are you firing people? Because when you fire people, when you let people go, that creates a void at the bottom. Now you need to initiate demand to recruit more people. So the specific laws would be Human Rights Code in Ontario, Human Rights Act federally, or the Employment Equity Act, both provincial and federal. Employment equity itself might initiate demand. For example, if you don't have enough female representation in your workforce, you might initiate a hiring process, a demand that says hire more females or a certain ethnic group or people with certain disabilities. Now, on the recruitment side, how you source applicants, where you get them from, how you advertise. Do you have any exclusionary practices? For example, Are you only recruiting in certain areas that might directly or indirectly exclude a certain segment of the population? I'm only recruiting in, let's say, through Seneca, and in Seneca, only certain types of people attend. You look at Seneca with the hugely diverse student population from all sectors, all segments of our society, versus, let's say, Sheridan College. And I'm just generalizing here. I don't have any evidence to produce, but I've taught at Sheridan. And it's in Oakville, the main campus, and you attract maybe a different type of a person. And it could be because the housing is a lot more expensive in that area. It could be partly because of reputation. It could be a lot of different things. But if you're exclusively going to one place, you might be disadvantaging a certain group who couldn't travel to your campus. Right? If you're only using certain agencies, and those agencies themselves or headhunters themselves have certain biases, they'll only deal with the most exclusive universities or only people from private schools, whatever it might be. Now, you might not realize it, but that is, in fact, not right. It doesn't say specifically it's illegal. But remember, a lot of this law doesn't specifically outline what you should or should not do. They're essences or principles that you should observe. Location bias. And again, we just discussed that. If you're, looking only at people that are living within 5 kilometers of your factory, that might exclude a whole segment of the population that maybe lives somewhere else. And look, I'll just say it. If you look at the Greater Toronto area, there are clusters. And we know these, right? In Brampton, you get a lot of South Asians. In Scarborough, you get a lot of East Asians. I'm not sure any other part, where I live in Richmond Hill, a lot of Asians. You might go up north and you might not get any ethnic diversity. And that relates to ethnic cluster bias. Like, are you looking at only a certain segment? Look, we had a client that was making parts, auto parts, right? Parts for the automotive industry, massive company. And if you go to any one of their production facilities, you'd notice, wait, there's something going on here. And I'm not just referring to color of skin, but you can tell, you can talk to people, you can see, just by holidays that they celebrate alone. Are you asking only that group to refer their friends? And over the years, it might just be all these people are referring their friends. Good employees, great people. But then you end up with an ethnic cluster. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then there might be an entire different ethnic group that you're excluding because of that. And a lot of people say, yeah, but is that my concern? Like, I have a company to run. And I'm getting good employees. People are referring people. What's wrong with that? In fact, am I not reverse discriminating against that ethnic group if I force myself to go somewhere else? And look, maybe in a smaller organization, it might cause undue hardship to force yourself to go outside of what you've been doing already. It's possible. These are things you have to keep in the back of your head. Could I work a little harder to include a different segment of the population? Can I maybe advertise in certain ethnic newspapers? Or go to agencies that operate in certain neighborhoods? Maybe these are difficult concepts to think about. Maybe they're uncomfortable. But in a business setting, you have to put that aside. It is possible. And then, of course, the one we're going to talk about a lot is the accessibility side, the AODA. Is your application process set up in a way that it doesn't allow certain people with maybe certain disabilities, and it could be physical disabilities or cognitive disabilities, to apply? So if you're asking people to apply online, that's fine. I mean, that's it's called e-recruitment, electronic recruitment. But what about people who don't have maybe access to or ready access to, and we call that the digital divide, those who can access technology, those who cannot, either for socio-economic reasons, or they just can't use a keyboard because they have a sight problem or hearing problem, or they can't write. And you have to look at that. Can we somehow make that process a little bit better? What if you ask people to come to your factory, your office directly, and apply in person? Are there any sort of mobility issues? And the general idea is if you have a mobility issue in coming to my workplace to apply, then how in the world will you actually come to my workplace to work? We have to be very careful there because it might be an undue hardship for somebody to just come for one day and versus making plans for a long period of time. So some of the laws that specifically deal with the recruitment side would be labor union rules, and that would be the Ontario Labor Relations Act or the Canada Labor Code. And I put labor relations down there as well. But you know what? Listen, if your union has certain rules in terms of entry into a certain profession, like it's a closed shop, you have to be a member before you can enter. And that's fine. That's legitimate. You're discriminating against people who are not part of that group. In fact, Seneca does it. If you're not a union, well, you can get a job as a faculty member if you're not a union member. It's a OPSU, Ontario Public Service Employees Union. But people who are union members across the province get first rights to a job. And they have to be scrutinized heavily before you go outside to non-union members. And you know what? Those rules are legit. They're legitimate. They sound discriminatory. You might not get the right applicant pool. It sounds unfair. But then we have the whole labor management system in place as a protection. And then human rights, of course. You know, when you're recruiting, everything about excluding a certain group or including only another group, those are human rights issues. AODA we talked about. And then, of course, privacy. Privacy is going to be everywhere. I'm not going to keep talking about it. Is once you receive applications from people, what can you do with those applications? How public can you make them? How do you share them with different managers? Now, on the selection side, so now we've got a lot of applicants, and we filter them through for minimum requirements, bona fide occupational requirements, and they move to the next stage, which is selection. And this is where your interviews and your employment tests and your background checks kick in. Are the practices you're using to select from a larger group to narrow down that group, are they fair? Are there fair practices? Are you only looking at candidates from a certain point of view, physical, aesthetic? Are you asking the right questions? Are those questions formatted, worded in a way that might exclude certain people from understanding? For example, we call that an ethnocentricity. You know, as a Canadian, I grew up here. There's certain analogies or certain examples that I understand. I struggle with others, but imagine a new immigrant who came. They get it. They're smart. They know how to do the job. But your questions are using certain isms, certain ideas, wording that maybe they have to digest. It takes them a little bit longer. And quite often, it could be cultural. The person you're asking this to, they dare not question or ask you what it means because it's a sign of disrespect. Now you're excluding that person from doing well in the selection process simply because of the types of questions you're asking. Or it could be a language barrier. I mean, look, if you're hiring a machine operator who needs to understand very rudimentary English, you can't say you need to speak English in order to do this job. It's not a bona fide requirement. You need to be able to communicate at the minimal level with managers and for safety purposes. But if you're asking questions that are very high-end management style wording, you're in fact discriminating against people who English is a second language. You have to put that to thought. Are there any sort of barriers? I mean, it might be unfair to have somebody in a wheelchair apply, get an interview, and you don't have a ramp. Legally, you might not be required to have a ramp in your workplace. But are there any sort of physical barriers? Is it possible for the person to get there? If you're asking candidates to fly in at their own cost to do an interview, and that happens sometimes, are they able to get on an airplane? What if somebody has some sort of a phobia, some sort of a fear of flying? Can you make alternate arrangements? I mean, listen, the examples I can give you can go on and on and on. In the textbook, there's a little bit more. In my notes, there's a little bit more. You just have to think about it. What's reasonable? Does this make sense to me? Can I remove any of those physical barriers? And nowadays, of course, we're doing a lot of interviewing via Skype or WebEx, webcam, right? Live video. Is there a way you can limit that? If people don't have access to that technology, are you not discriminating against those people? Again, that's called a digital divide. And don't forget the cognitive, the behavioral limitations, the emotional, mental health issues. Are you causing barriers to people through maybe time limitations, distance, perhaps even the way you interview? I mean, listen, if you only give a paper and pencil survey to a candidate, and it happens that that's maybe a barrier for them, they have dyslexia or problem reading or concentrating, focusing, and it causes anxiety. Is there a way you can reasonably, without undue hardship, eliminate that barrier, maybe verbally, orally give that survey? Again, if it's a part of the job to be able to fill out paper and pencil surveys, yes, I get it. But you have to question that as well. Does your selection process have any sort of bias? And I don't mean you, not the recruiter. I'm talking about the manager. In the last section, we learned that managers are not HR. They're not trained. They haven't taken this course. And a lot of managers believe they just know. I just know when the person's going to work out. And that's fine. Maybe they do. Maybe their intuition is strong. But have you tested it? Have you formalized it? Well, we can offer training to our managers. And they might be resistant. They quite often are. But you offer sensitivity training. You offer anti-bias training. You explain to them how to do proper interviews. And in fact, I would insist that HR sits in on interviews. Sure, it's a burden, but we're putting in protections for fair treatment of everybody. Sometimes we give employment tests. Things like Excel or language tests or writing tests. We do background checks sometimes, criminal checks, financial checks. Are any of those tests biased in any way or exclusionary to certain segments? Again, all that about writing, reading. Now, if you're going to give, let's say, an Excel test, and we talked about that in the last session, and Excel is a very important part of the job, then of course the incumbent or the person who you're testing should be able to do Excel in the way it's supposed to be done on a computer on a large screen. But could be a matter of what room are they doing it in? How quiet is it? Does it realistically simulate the work environment? Think about the barriers to that. If there are any accessibility issues, maybe a large screen, a zoom feature on the screen. And then background checks. And there's an American thing that says, well, in Canada, look, if you had a criminal record and you served your time or you were excused, you can't use that against a person. You can find out. There's a lot of ways to find out. Or financial history for that matter. There's a basis for discrimination for these, yes. The U.S., it's a whole different thing. Yeah, you can look at a person's background. I mean, poor person who had a criminal record for something small that didn't sound criminal, they served their time, they paid their price, and just because of that, you will never hire them. That is highly discriminatory. I mean, how do people in that situation reintegrate with society? It's rare. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time. But if you think about it, if I was going to hire a person working in a bank in an area called a cage, where they're dealing with sensitive instruments or monetary instruments like money or gold, sure. If a person has some sort of a criminal record, you can justify that level of discrimination, I suppose. Or if you're working with children or seniors. Now, the specific laws that deal with selection, and you see a theme going on here, is pretty much the same. Human rights always. Employment equity. Listen, if you had to hire 2 more females, and out of the 10 candidates, 8 of them were males, 2 were female, you have to meet a target. And maybe a male candidate was slightly better, but then you would tend to hire the female to fill your quota. That's okay, as long as it doesn't hurt your business, right? But you still have to satisfy employment equity targets. And again, that's also a legitimate reason to discriminate in the recruitment side, where you would target recruitment efforts to only the disabled community or an ethnic community. Labor relations, of course, unions. If you're union, the entire process of how you select candidates with very low scrutiny, that changes as well. And again, I'll tell you how Seneca works. I'd love to, if I sat in on an interview to hire you as a faculty member, I'd like to probe and really ask you deep questions, you specifically, just to get to the truth of what you're saying, the essence. But we can't. They're almost robotic. We have to treat every candidate exactly the same. Then AODA and privacy, that goes without saying. Now, once you select the right candidates, and we went 3 to 5, you pick the best, and you're going to make a job offer. And hopefully the person accepts a job offer. You've hired them. So in that process, are you fair? When you actually decided who to hire, was it in fact the best candidate for the job based on merit and bona fide requirements and criteria? Or did you tend to pick the one that maybe was aesthetically the most pleasing, or the one that was the most like you, looked like you, sounded like you, reminded you of you? Those are discriminatory practices. It happens all the time, of course. We use the example of a receptionist. Walk into 10 different organizations, and their mainline receptionist, how do they talk? What's their accent? How do they look? Think about it. Even retail stores, restaurants even. Think about it. You go to a restaurant. What's that one? It's called, at Fairview Mall, it's called Moxie's, I think. Look at all the wait staff. They look a certain way. Maybe that's legitimate. I don't know. But again, think about how you're discriminating a segment of the population. Now, if the business were to lose customers because you didn't hire a certain look, a certain set of characteristics, there might be a case to be made. I'm just going to remind you, none of this is my thinking. This is not necessarily my thinking. I'm just telling you how people would think, possibly. Also, when you hire somebody, the pay that you give, the entire package, the pay mix, including benefits, do any of those have unfair practices? We do have a Pay Equity Act. Female employees should be paid equal for work of equal value, equal pay for work of equal value. Are you offering less money to females versus males? Are you offering more money to certain groups, age-wise maybe, gender, ethnicity, maybe even religion? I mean, there's lots to be written about that. Is it possible? If you're like me, I'm going to pay you more. My money out of my pocket should go to my people. Oh my God, that happens all the time, of course. I mean, I'm not suggesting it happens everywhere. In a union environment, of course, it doesn't necessarily happen. But remember, there's somebody in HR who's going to decide where to put you on the scale. How are they doing that? Is it an objective process, or is it somewhat subjective? And I'll tell you, right at Seneca, and you could download our collective agreement and look at how it works. It's misunderstood, actually. I mean, there's a lot of kind of technical stuff in there. But the person who decides the number of points you get to determine which step in the salary range that you are placed at, I know for a fact much of it's objective. It's either you have it or you don't. You either have a PhD or you don't. But some of it is subjective. It's called a discretion. And you have to investigate to see if those are discriminatory. Are there any accommodations required? When you hire somebody, right? You can't ask too many questions before you hire them. But after the fact, you can. And if you discover that there's maybe a physical disability, this is fine. Nothing wrong with that. But then you have to accommodate. Might be a wheelchair, might be assistive technology on the computers, might be modified work situations. As long as it's not an undue hardship, financial hardship on your organization, you should accommodate. And if you're union, there's rules, of course. And then health and safety kicks in. The person you are hiring, are they able to satisfy and meet the requirements of health and safety laws, rules, regulations, and also your own policy? Is it possible that it's a discriminatory thing? Now, I'll give you an example. You've heard this case in your employment law course. It's a landmark case out of British Columbia. Binder versus some company, I forget. And the man was wearing a turban. And it's a religious thing. If you're deeply religious in that faith, the Sikh faith, you have to wear a turban. But he worked as a construction employee. And of course, a province at some point enacted a law that says you cannot enter the site without a hard hat. Now, you know that you need a hard hat. But during the interviews, you look at this guy and says, there's no way he can wear a hard hat. And if you're into these theories, you can say, well, maybe the turban serves as a hard hat. A brick falls on his head, the turban will protect him. No, you're not the scientist. You did not study this. You're not a standards association. Anyways, this particular case went to court. And what the company didn't do is they didn't ask themselves, how can we reasonably accommodate? Right? Listen, the requirement in that faith is to have a headdress. So you can modify a hard hat to cover the head and make that a requirement. Right? You're doing your diligence, you're mitigating. It could be somebody in a wheelchair might not be able to satisfy requirements of health and safety. It's possible. So refer to your health and safety course and see how you can protect yourself from discrimination in the hiring process. So the laws are listed there. I'm not going to keep repeating all of these. I think I just added Occupational Health and Safety Act. And also I added the Employment Standards Act. So this is when employment standards kick in. These are the set of rights given to an employee. Candidates don't necessarily have them, but employees do. And are you respecting those? Are you satisfying those requirements? In fact, look, I'll give you an example. The Employment Standards Act and the Canada Labour Code guarantee a thing called maternity leave or parental leave. You have to give it. And, the rules are you have to give it. You can't fire a person because of being pregnant or father for, if they're expecting a baby, the wife or the mom, I should say. But you might look at a person and say, you're clearly pregnant. Well, first of all, you're not a doctor. You can't determine that. You can't even ask. But you might say, no, I'm not going to hire this person because they're going to get pregnant. They're going to have a baby. They're going to leave. And in organizations where you actually pay, you top up more than employment insurance. You top up parental or maternity benefits. That could be costly for you. And it could be an undue financial hardship. But if you can afford it, and this person was good, they were going to do good work for you, then you need to keep that person and actually, in fact, hire them. Think about it. The baby they're about to have is going to be your future employee. Now, once we hire somebody, hopefully we do orientation or onboarding, introducing the person to the workplace, the physical environment, the job itself, the people. Are there fair practices in orientation onboarding? Are you offering the onboarding orientation reasonably, equally to everybody who enters? Because if not, you might not be able to alleviate some of the stress and anxiety associated with the new job. And then that person might just not do well on the job. And your performance system might catch them as a bad employee, all because you didn't orient everybody the same way. Does orientation sufficiently offer inclusion? The timing you're offering it, how far is it? Are you offering onboarding on a computer? Well, do people have access to it? Is it in a language that people can understand? Why not use videos and pictures? And also accessibility. and the safety side of orienting onboarding. You tell an employee, hey, just walk around the factory, get to know it. Well, yeah, that's good, but can the person do it? Is it safe? Will it affect their health in any way? And the 3 laws that I'm referring to are here. Then, of course, once you do that, within 3-month period, hopefully, you want to test the employee out. You want to do performance management, performance appraisals to make sure that they're working out, because you have a window there, 3 months generally, to let that person go without cause. I mean, it can't be discriminatory. For example, you keep hiring women because to satisfy a quota, females, and then they invariably get let go before the probationary period. So on the one hand, it looks like you met your numbers. On the other hand, you're letting people go. Well, is it fair? When you're doing performance management, is it fair the way you're doing it? Are you doing it across the board? Is it transparent enough? In fact, in the next session, we are going to talk about performance management. I think it's the next session. And then once the employee works out for you, and all your staff, all your workforce, might as well throw this one in, everything, all the laws across the board apply to everything you do in HR. And again, let me remind you, you don't need to be a lawyer. You need to know the framework so that you can at least call a lawyer and avoid certain mistakes. Everything we just talked about applies to everybody. And that goes equally to the outbound side. When you decide to let people go because they're not working out, you have to respect certain rights as well. Here's some questions we need to consider. I just threw a few in here, right, just to get you going, the thought process. Remember, it takes years of your practicing human resources to become well-versed in these things. Right now, you need to be aware and ask lots of questions. So some questions to consider. Are there employment equity targets? Do you do employment equity? Do you have to do it? Are there any physical barriers to consider? How much of a burden is it to put things in place to eliminate these barriers, physical or cognitive? Are there any non-physical, social, emotional, mental health barriers to consider? That would be the cognitive. Is the interview process fair? I mean, how are you interviewing? Is it wishy-washy? Do you have 3 different people interviewing in HR, all have a different style, different flair? Well, if they're all doing it for the exact same job you're recruiting for, that's not right at all. I think it should be very consistent. That's why we have structured interviews, things that are written down. And you're going to cover that off in the second half of the course. That's actually the golden part. That's what you need to know. I'm doing some background stuff up front. That's the way the textbook is set up. The questions that you're asking, either during an interview or on a survey, are they uniform? Check the language, check the wording. Have they been validated? And demographic neutral. Like, did you actually look at the questions to see if they're content related? I mean, during our interviews at Seneca, I'll tell you, and I'm not putting it down in any way, it's a system that works, obviously. But there's 3 questions that always get asked of everybody, I think, across the board. And quite often, they don't make sense to that particular job we're recruiting for. I mean, we ask them, I suppose. But they haven't really been validated with just something to do, I guess. Check for ethnocentricity, age centricity. Look, I'm convinced there's young people who don't understand certain words because they were used 30 years ago. Likewise, there's probably older people who don't understand certain language either. You know what I mean? Ask yourself, is it really that important for that age segment to understand the question? Or can they still do the job without knowing that particular question, the wording on it? Change the question. You're going to learn in the second half how to come up with questions. Is there any systemic or indirect discrimination? We're going to talk about that later. But sometimes you're discriminating and you don't even know. And I gave you lots of examples. For example, are you only looking at people in a certain geographic region, part of the city? That could be systemic. Are you only looking at certain institutions, like Seneca, not realizing that maybe Seneca attracts a certain type of person, group of people? Another college might have a more varied, more balanced group of people. Are your interviewers trained? You yourself, your managers, have they been given conscious and subconscious bias training? And I like this one. Are records kept? I mean, are you just doing this? Are you actually keeping records? What's your protocol on saving the notes you took during interviews? Who compares them? What's your process for comparing the notes? Are you coding them? Is it structured enough? Are your job descriptions and specifications in order? I mean, well, first question is, do you actually have job descriptions or specifications? If not, ask yourself why. What are you recruiting on the basis of? I mean, how do you know what competencies are required? That's, I mean, pretty much a source of discrimination right there. If you don't know the competencies you're recruiting for, then you might be looking at different candidates or different applicants from a different view. That's not right. You wouldn't want me marking your tests based on that, would you? Are the tests that you're giving, employment tests, are they valid, reliable? Are you applying them consistently? You can't just give the test to some people and say, well, you don't have to do it because you took the course at Seneca. No, not true. You have to. Where did you get the employment test from? Did you buy it? Did a consultant set it up? Was a psychometrist involved? I gave you an example in the last session. The reference and background checks you do, are they documented? Do you need to do them? You know, if you called a previous employer for a reference check, did you ask yourself if that employer was bitter and unfair towards that candidate? You have to be careful there. Does a financial background check really impact the ability of the person to do the job and their trust factor, what we call fiduciary duty? This is a good one. We're going to talk about this later in the second last session. Use of social media and public-facing internet material. I mean, you can vet candidates, I suppose. Not necessarily applicants, but candidates once they pass through to the selection process. Should you look at their social media? LinkedIn, yes. LinkedIn always. I mean, I don't think you should ever put something on LinkedIn you don't want an employer to see. But then you have a personal life too. You can put things on Facebook, what's that other one? Pinterest, Instagram, TikTok. I don't know how that works. But am I allowed to look at that? Well, it depends. I think you learned in your employment law course that depends on the position. You know, the president of Seneca, who is the face of Seneca, has to be very careful what he does out in public facing social media. Because, you know, a mistake that he makes might cost or damage the reputation of the institution. But if it's a machine operator who deals in, goth culture, alternate lifestyles, and they're allowed to on the Facebook, can you discriminate on that basis? No, I don't think so. It might be a personal dislike. And that's where training your managers, especially the senior managers, is very important. We're humans, right? Humans can't just forget things. Those systemic things, those stereotypes, those biases that are ingrained in their mind. But you can certainly use training to educate managers of how to look from a very objective point of view. I mean, look, if you sat on a jury in a court, it's your civic duty, you have to do it. And the judge says, you will strike that from your memory. Really? Somebody just said it. I just saw a picture. How the heck do I forget it? Of course it influences you. You're not trained. Judges are trained. You're not. But that's just something we do. It's a matter of public trust. A basic human character. Are you offering training fairly to people? Is compensation fair? Are you achieving pay equity if you have to? Are you discriminating on that basis? You're not allowed to. Sure, you can. If a person works harder, they get more money, of course. But you can't say, well, that person or that group of people will definitely work for less money. I'll just pay them less. No, you can't. I don't think you can do that. That's not fair. It's not ethical. There might not be a law, but it's not ethical. Are the performance management systems that you used, are they standardized? Are they relevant, fair? Who designed them? We have another section for this. We'll talk about it later. Mobility, emotional intelligence, we'll talk about later. Personality testing, wow. Talk about unfair right there. There's merit for it. We'll talk about it later as well. Are you respecting the requirements of a union management relationship, labor management relationship, if you're a unionized environment? And you know what, on the flip side, is there basis for discrimination? I mean, a lot of things a lot of people perceive to be discriminatory might actually be grounded, might be legitimate. And, you know, the difference is who judges. So, for example, if the National Hockey League, professional hockey, only hires males to play in that league, that's discriminatory. Females can be way better than any male player, but they can't try out for any of those teams. No team will hire them. They're discriminating. But the truth is, on historical and traditional grounds, the league is a male league. It's always been that way, and it's been tested in court. Then they are allowed to discriminate. Right? If you're looking for magazine models or television models or actors, there's a lot of basis for discrimination because the movie has to portray a character a certain way, and the actor has to fit that or be able to portray their own character in that way. Can I discriminate against you for having a certain lifestyle? If you're going to be working, let's say, with children, got to be careful when you say that. Yes or no? I mean, prove it. Where's the science on it? But if in that case, if the parents of the children say, no, we will not accept this, that would make the business go bankrupt. And yes, then that could be made as a case for discrimination. It's possible, but we're looking at sensitive or vulnerable populations. And maybe my business has specific needs, maybe related to the customer need. So if a customer demands a certain type of characteristics in their employees who represent knowledge of something, for example, and there's only a certain group of people, certain ethnicity who has that knowledge or that communication ability, then yeah, sure, case could be made there. Maybe on the basis of safety, and we talked about the turban issue. But imagine you have a really good candidate in a wheelchair, no reasonable accommodation can be made for safety purposes. Yes, you're protecting your business, you're protecting that individual, although it might not seem fair. And maybe it's economic grounds, like your business just can't afford certain accommodations. And then we call that undue hardship. Now, I don't know how much you think about what discrimination means. You know, people throw that word around a lot. I've been discriminated against. You know, a lot of people out there, especially in the media, when you use the word discrimination, it usually boils down to some sort of an ethnic thing or a lifestyle thing. I've been discriminated. That's discrimination. That's a discriminatory practice. Well, maybe, yeah, it is that. But it could be a lot of different things. In a class, if I only ask questions to certain people sitting to the right of me, that could be viewed as a discriminatory practice. I'm discriminating against people on the left of me, you leftists. Well, not necessarily. It's just that people sitting on the right always tend to answer. People on the left never answer, so I focus my attention on the right. But see, the difference is I get it, but the rest of the class didn't perceive it that way. They didn't think of it that way. They thought it was unfair. And you want to be very careful with that. That idea that people develop perceptions of discrimination, because word will spread like wildfire. So keep things fair and transparent, up front. So direct discrimination is what we know. It's when an organization knows that it's doing it, it's happening, and it allows it to continue. Or individuals for that matter. You know you're only hiring pretty good-looking receptionists. And you say, yeah, but that makes sense, without thinking about why it makes sense or not. You know that you're allowing supervisors in the factory to get employees to refer their own relatives or friends who happen to be part of the same ethnic cluster. You allow it. The system works. Move on with life. That's the way people think. It might be discriminatory, but it's direct. Indirect discrimination maybe is a little bit more dangerous. Because it happens, you might not know it's happening. The adverse effects, the damaging effects are there. There's no intent necessarily. It's not like I would sit there and say, I'm doing it. It's going to harm people, but whatever. Maybe there's no intent on the part of the organization. Maybe people just don't know it. It's systemic. It fits in. So for example, if you have work hours, work schedules, and you say, nope, it's got to be 9 to 5, too bad. That's the way it is. But realistically, you can allow certain people to work alternate on a day or two. And if it's a religious requirement for a person not to work, let's say Fridays or Sundays, the Sabbath or Lord's Day, or prayers, certain times of day. And as long as a person gets the job done, and you allow them maybe to take breaks alternately, you have to put that thought into it. You might not realize that it's actually happening. It's indirect. Now, accommodation, I won't cover this in too much detail. I think you've heard about this in health and safety in general, HR, employment law. It's whenever you feel, okay, so there is some sort of practice in place that might not be fair, equitable, and that you accommodate. You change a normal practice or something that you are doing to benefit a designated group. Can you accommodate? And we usually refer to accommodations with people with some sort of a disability or lack of ability, physical or cognitive. But accommodations could be it could be religious. Person with a certain religion who has to take part of a Friday off or during certain ethnic holidays. I mean, that's not a physical or cognitive impairment, is it? Religion is not an impairment. I mean, unless you watch Bill Maher, that's a whole different thing. Television show on HBO. Google it. But can your organization reasonably, with fair thought, accommodate? Or do you have the attitude, I don't need to, I'm not going to because nobody else is doing it? I don't think that's what our democratic society is all about. I think you have to ingrain that into your culture, saying, no, we will treat people as fairly as possible as long as it doesn't affect my business. Because remember, if your business hurts and it goes bankrupt, it doesn't help anybody. And of course, a lot of it has been tested in courts. You have to rely on that as well. But why take it there in the first place? What if you had to install different type of equipment like desks because of a physical impairment? Alternate safety equipment. Talked about turbines. I'm trying to think of other ones, but you can read my notes. There's all sorts of accommodations. The ramp for a wheelchair. As simple as maybe putting in a button on a machine that's a little bit lower so a person in a wheelchair can reach it. All other things being the same. It's not going to cost you that much. Do it. Now, there's a concept of sufficient risk. I don't know, it's a legal thing, I guess. Sufficient risk. The idea that a practice, something that you do, that is discriminatory in nature, and you try to fix it, you try to mitigate, you try to accommodate. but then it causes a safety problem. You cannot. Okay, so sufficient risk means that whatever it is you're going to put into place cannot harm or go against any sort of safety or health measure, Occupational Health and Safety Act. I think that's paramount. Now, a lot of what we just talked about requires an individual to have a certain amount of emotional intelligence. I love this topic. I talk about it a lot. I write about it a lot. In fact, one of my biggest disappointments in life, I'll share it with you personally, is that there are not enough people around me who are willing to or have the knowledge of what emotional intelligence is. In fact, it's a basis of most arguments within families and at the store or on a bus, or if you're waiting in line. You see people getting angry. You see it on TV all the time. Hate. Not recognizing that not everybody's the same. You don't think like me, therefore you are not. I mean, that's lacking emotional intelligence. It's simply your conscious and subconscious intelligence. How intelligent are you when it comes to the emotions and needs, the feelings of other people? And mostly we think of it as mental health limitations. I get it. Now look at that line. It said all humans can experience and demonstrate emotions such as happy, sad, angry, hurt, frustration, anxiety. Well, anxiety is not an emotion. It's a result of an emotion, I suppose. Manifestation. But the way we individually interpret and present these emotions is what makes us different. And that's great. Else we'd all be robots and zombies, right? Now, if you look at it within our Canadian population, it's changed. It's hugely diverse. That's what makes us awesome. That's what makes us the single best country in the world. So if you see a person walking on the wrong side of the sidewalk, and I got to admit it bothers me too. We walk a certain way. We walk on the right? But in other countries, it's the opposite. And, you know, a person walks towards you and go, what the heck are you doing? Get on the other side. And you get angry. It's that anger, that presentation of your emotion that maybe causes a problem, because that leads you now to believe later on in life that everybody who is that type of a person maybe shouldn't be near you. And that includes the workplace. I mean, we're digging deep here. I told you, the closer we get to the end, we're really going to bring it on. And you got to promise me none of you are going to get upset by anything I say, because this is a training ground for you to accept the same when you get into the HR environment. Oh, I'll say things. No, it's not personal. I have to come up with examples, don't I? In fact, I want to make you all cry and laugh. Because when you experience that today, that emotion, then you'll be able to help your employees deal with it and or educate your managers to avoid it or accept it. I want to read the last line. Our understanding and practice of empathy, sympathy. Look those words up, okay? Respect for others and their emotions, together with our ability to change our response, is very important. And that, in fact, perfectly defines what emotional intelligence is. Can you, being who you are, see a behavior in another, either physical or not, and then ask yourself right away, before you react, before you get angry or mad, can you ask yourself, why did that person do it? What is the context behind why that person did it? Or am I just hating it? Am I just hating it because it is not what I would have done? Well, you're lacking emotional intelligence. Are you willing to accept the behavior you deem to be negative or dysfunctional, that in another, because it is not what you are willing to accept? Based on what benchmark? Now, I get certain things, like spitting gum on the sidewalk. You know, some places it's illegal, like Singapore. But here, it's not illegal. I don't think it is anyway. There's a littering law. Or spitting. It's one of my bothers right there. But I don't let it bother me to the point where if it's not affecting me, I call the person out. I might say politely, please don't do that, just to educate. But I see way too often people getting angry or calling people out for reasons that don't make sense. Watch the news, you'll see. And the example I gave in the last lesson was the day I went to McDonald's, and the girl on the other side simply just questioned my question. And I thought, what? Like, I don't know how your kitchen works. How the heck do I know French fries aren't a breakfast item? And that person assumed that I'm just as intelligent as they are. I don't work for McDonald's. I don't know what the heck they serve before 11. Heck, I don't even know that it was 11. But they assumed I did, and they got mad at me, or at least put me down. Sure, I'm blowing it out of proportions. It didn't ruin my meal. But imagine that sort of thing. Pretty much same sort of thing happens all the time in society and in the workplace, what damage that could cause. So, for some reason, that video, at least the characters, reminded me of something about a movie called The Wizard of Oz, or is it Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? I'm pretty sure it's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm not sure, the Oompa Loompas or something. Key takeaway there, I mean, that was a great video, is do you take ownership for the way you react to other people's actions? Are you willing to sit there and understand why you feel that another person's action is not the way you would have done it, or why it angers you, before you react to the other person? I mean, how many people around you do you know that just flip their lid? In fact, it's dangerous to them because it causes anxiety. How many people do you know who sit and think, why did the other person do what they just did? And then react. And if it's a matter of, or an opportunity to educate the other person how things should be done, that's fine. There's a calm, professional way of doing it. And this is something you need to train your managers on as well. On the flip side, though, are you the type of person who obsesses about every way you think about what another person does? Not necessarily blow up, but holding it all in. That's not healthy either. If you're a worrier, especially if you understand emotional intelligence and you're always worried, oh my God, what I just did, how did the other person perceive it? That's a good thing. You have to do that. You have to self-reflect on your own actions and others' attitudes and perceptions towards it, but you can't obsess about it. And that's one thing in HR. I've seen too many HR people who keep it bottled. They get affected too much. But if they develop, and the video said it does take time and effort, if you develop this sense, almost in an objective sort of science sort of way, that I will always sit and listen and think about why the other person did or said what they did, without jumping to conclusions and taking action, knee-jerk reaction, or what's the other word, kind of snap judgments. When you do that, you become emotionally balanced. I'm not turning this into a behavioral therapy in any way. That's not the point. I'm not questioning your personal attitudes towards things. I'm saying that in a business setting, especially in HR, you have to have a layer of Teflon and be able to be that central, neutral type of a figure who can bring calm to a situation. If you yourself are overreacting, just like you would to children, they see that, and it causes anxiety in them, causes a layer of mistrust, I think. And HR can't afford that. We have to be impartial, but also react. If the other person's behavior deserves some harsh criticism or actions, then that makes sense, fine. But quite often it doesn't. Balanced and grounded HR staff. And of course your managers, don't forget. That's harder to do. You'll be demonstrating less bias. People will respect you more, I think. You know, there's room for tough management, yes, but not all the time. And a key concept here is the regulation of emotions. You know, people on the spectrum, if you look at the mental health side of things, they're lacking what we call self-regulation. And it's a both internalized and external process. It's in the brain. It's cognitive. That we get. But not every human in the world is on the spectrum, yet every human in the world has mental health. You have to. Mental health is not a bad or good thing. It's a thing. Everybody has it. But the key thing is your self-regulation, your ability to show empathy, to put yourself in the shoes of another, and then, of course, demonstrate sympathy when required. But quite often our prejudices, wherever they come from, our discriminatory ways, or even our stereotypes, maybe they sometimes get in the way. And you know what? I'm convinced for some people it's fun. You ever know anybody that it just wouldn't be fun for them unless they gossiped or picked on somebody? And I'll throw the word bullying in there and shaming and all of that thing you hear about. It happens in the workplace too. It shows a lack of a lack of emotional intelligence. Or maybe that person was never corrected. It's not genetic, I'll tell you that. HR can go a long way to fix that problem. In fact, start with the recruitment process. You can do emotional intelligence testing, personality type testing. Ask the right questions, behaviorally anchored questions to see how balanced a person is. Now, there's a lot more work to be done here, so be very careful. But then we're recruiting people that are like-minded with a certain attitude, that certain passion of care for others. They're able to get the job done. I just gave you some very broad end terms to get you thinking about emotional intelligence. I want to create a wave of you, the new graduates, are going to bring this into the equation of the HR department at your new organization. EI. Read more about it. Some food for thought before we end. I want you to think personally and be honest with yourself, okay? You don't have to share it with me. Maybe in the last class. Think of examples when you have demonstrated bias. And it could be subtle, small things. Or were you biased towards one sibling or one parent? Was a parent biased towards you or against you? Remember, bias goes both ways. I have a bias towards sweet things, except chocolate. I have a negative bias towards chocolate. I mean, I like chocolate, I just don't eat it. Okay, I don't really like it. There's an emotional intelligence test link in the notes. I want you to click it, try it. It's really fun. It's not scientific, relax, don't change yourself because of it. It's just a basis to get you to start thinking. How can you improve your score, whatever it might be? And then how can you help in an HR setting, help your staff and your managers be more emotionally balanced? Now keep in mind, there are going to be a lot of people who have figured out emotional intelligence, and they're quite capable of faking it. I mean, a student who's looking for some sort of reaction from a teacher, some sort of sympathetic action, they're quite capable of faking some of this, I suppose. On the most part, it's okay. I've seen it year after year. Maybe acting classes, I don't know what it is. But then we're also good at noticing what that might be. Just the right number of questions you can ask to validate. Your employees the same way. You can't be so objective, this process. It's a checklist. That takes a human out of it. So in the next session, we're going to revisit an idea that you started exploring in two other courses, I believe compensation management and also intro to HR. We're going to take a unique view to it and try to associate it with this whole thing called competency management and recruitment and selection talent management in general. And we are going to revisit and add to our understanding of competencies themselves and see how they have more of an impact on the whole recruitment selection process. I think competencies are super important. They should be the basis for pretty much a lot of things we do in business and HR and maybe even in life. And the more you understand about them and the more you're able to map them and identify their value, the better I think you can create or fine-tune your workforce. So we'll see you in the next session.